on Wednesday, we kind of wrapped up starting to look at the theology and the themes of Exodus, right? Do you guys remember some of the major themes that we were looking at, the four big ones?
Bondage and deliverance.
Bondage and deliverance, and Thelma pointed out that even possibly seeing Isaac in that was another way of kind of seeing that alluded to even in how the Hebrew authors wrote the stories of Genesis, which is really good. What else is there?
God's power versus
Good.
Pharaoh's power.
God's power versus Pharaoh's power. What else?
Tension between divine presence and absence.
Divine presence and absence. And the last one, somebody else?
Covenant obedience and disobedience.
Good. Covenant obedience and disobedience. I want to touch on real quick the tension or the conflict between God's power and Pharaoh's power. And some ways in Exodus that this gets alluded to. God's power versus Pharaoh's power. Okay, I want to bring this up specifically because it has to do with the grammatical criticism you all do. So if we pull up here, I've got Exodus pulled up here in Blue Letter Bible. Let's go to Exodus chapter 3. Okay. And the question about Genesis chapter 3 was the word for hand that's used here. What's that?
Chapter 3. Exodus?
Exodus 3, I'm sorry, not Genesis. Let me see how the KJV does. We might have to switch translations. No, that's fine. Okay. How does your NRSV translate this beginning passage? And I came down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians.
How does the hand
Yeah,
What
it
does
just
it
says
say?
from the Egyptians.
It just says from the Egyptians, right? So here's a place where we see how translations, even really good ones, in trying to make something coherent or in try to convey a certain meaning, sometimes leave out certain parts, right? So I'm guessing that the writers of, or the translators of the NRSV just thought, to say at the hand of the Egyptians, we can just say out of the Egyptians, or like from the Egyptians, and that's fine. But I think there's something really important going on here with the author mentioning hand. Right, so if we look here, we see here, out of the hand, the text actually says the word, we click on the Strong's letter, actually says the word for hand in there. Right, so this doesn't just say that I've come to deliver you from the Egyptians. It literally says hand. And the reason I think that's important is because if we look at other uses of this word that are maybe close to it in proximity, come down here, that's right, I have to go all the way to the bottom. We have to go to here. You see the word hand gets used a lot. We pull down to, here we go, Exodus. Okay. Deliver us out of the hand, right? Or, sorry, deliver us out of the hand of the shepherds, out of the hand of the Egyptians. And I'm sure that the king, and this is just a little bit later, right? We're only, 11 verses later here with the word hand? And I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, and then a better way of phrasing this, unless by a mighty hand. And I will stretch out my hand, says the Lord, and smite Egypt. Right? So here you have the author comparing the hand of Pharaoh, the hand of the Egyptians, to God's hand. Right? And contrasting these two powers by using this idea of possessing in your hand. Right? And so it's very intentional that the word hand is being used here in 3:8, because the author is then going to contrast that with God's hand in 19 and 20. You see that? How the author's kind of comparing these two? If we go to, do it this way.
Are you on?
I think should be.
Oh, yeah,
It's okay. Let's look at Exodus. We'll keep it in 3 here. We're going to scroll down to 12. Now the KJV here translates this serve. How does your NRSV translate this passage right here in 3:12?
Is it worship?
Worship?
Right, worship. Right? What word's being used here?
Rod.
Yeah, avad, or avad, right? That's the word that's being used here for to serve. So let's take a closer look at this. Right? Could mean to work and to serve, right? But if you're serving God, what does that kind of imply? You're worshiping, right?
Oh, you're working and worshiping.
Don't know what that was about. Right? So the NRSV isn't going like way left field and saying worship. However, there are other words for worship that mean more like bowing down. Right? And my contention would be is that the author is using serve here because we are contrasting serving God and serving Pharaoh. Right? They are in forced service. They are slaves. To be a servant and a slave in Hebrew is about the same word, or can be the same word. And so here again, we're contrasting God's power and Pharaoh's power. Who has possession over the people? Right? So here's some ways that we use grammatical criticism to see just what the author is doing, just what the author is meaning by certain words, and how intentional the vocabulary is that these authors are using. Right? Giving them credit for not just throwing words on a page, but for being intentional in the vocabulary that they pick out. And so what we're going to see, as we alluded to on Wednesday, is that this competition between God and Pharaoh is a cosmic competition. Right? This is the forces of God, the power of God, against the forces of destruction and chaos. Okay? Because remember, in the beginning of Exodus, we talked about how the Hebrew people, the Israelites, were fruitful and multiplied. Right? And then Pharaoh sends out this decree to kill every firstborn or every male child, thereby making this impossible. Right? So again, these two powers set against one another. Now let's dig into this more in talking about creation theology, the kinds of ideas of creation that the authors pull from Genesis to tell the story of the Exodus. Right? Because remember, we talked about the Exodus as the birth of Israel. And this idea of creation is going to help demonstrate this. Right? Creation and birth are very similar ideas. Right? Like we said, we see this with Pharaoh, right? Thwarting the commands of creation. Right? Being fruitful and multiply is the command of creation, and Pharaoh is working against that. We also see this with the plagues. Because in the plagues, we see God demonstrating himself as the ruler and manipulator of the created world. Right? It is God who can shift and mold things and move things in such a way as he wills. Right? So with the plagues, we see, again, God as sovereign over creation. And in a sense, we can even think of the plagues as God returning upon Pharaoh the chaos that he is visiting upon the Israelites. Right? The chaos of trying to thwart creation and visiting that back upon the Egyptians. Right? But the most powerful moment of this whole story is really when creation theology shines through, and that's in the splitting of the Red Sea. Now, your book talks about the possibility that some scholars have put forth that this is actually supposed to read the Reed Sea, right? The Sea of Reeds. I'm not sure that's what the author's going for. I think the author wants to say the Red Sea. I just don't think the author is really considering this from a scientific, historical kind of narrative standpoint. I think the author wants us to envision this huge amount of water. I think that's what the author is going for, what the author wants to see. And once we kind of liberate the text from having to be constrained to a literary, or not a literary, but a historical, scientific worldview, once we liberate the text from that a little bit, we can see the way that the author is telling the story and the kind of meaning the author is giving this event. So, if we think about, the best way to actually think about the Red Sea is to read it through Israel's response. And Israel does that in Exodus 15, and that's where I want us to look. Okay. Now this is really important. Exodus 15, let me back it up one chapter so we can see what happens just before this. Just before this. And Israel saw the great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. Right before that, thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. Right? Again, this idea of out of the hand of the Egyptians. Right? God's hand has prevailed. And so, in 15, what we have is Israel's response. And what is that response? They sing. Do they sing just like, hey, let's sing a party song? Or is this, how would you say like this song would be a part of victory?
Yeah, it's a worship.
Good. Their response is worship. Right? This is, a fancy word for this is doxology. So we could even say their response is doxological. Okay. Israel's response is doxological. It's worship. After they see that they have been delivered, that they are firmly in God's hand and not the Egyptians' hand, then they sang. And sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord. Okay. Now, let's have fun with this. I'm going to kind of sit down here and look at some of these words that get used. So we can see maybe what's going on here in this song. And if you remember from that video, part of this song, or at least part of it, but probably a good portion of this, is considered to be one of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible, right? So this is a lot of fun to look into. So let's take a look. Look at Exodus 15:5. Right? The depths have covered them, the Egyptians. They sank into the bottom as a stone. I want, anytime we're looking at these, think about creation. What in this passage reminds you of creation? Any words stand out to you?
Depths.
Depths. Why does depth stand out? What's that?
When God separated the depth from the land or whatever.
Okay, good. So let's just make sure that this isn't just an English word being the same. Let's see if the Hebrew word's actually the same for this. Right? The depths to home. We click the Strong's number. Definition looks the same. Scroll down. Genesis 1:2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Right? This is the same word that's used in Genesis, in the creation. So here in Exodus 15:5, the depths have covered them. These primordial, chaotic seas have covered Pharaoh and Pharaoh's army. Right? This is what's being said in the text pretty explicitly. Let's look down to Exodus 15:8. Anything sound familiar there?
Nostrils.
Why does nostrils sound familiar? Okay, let's see. This is KJV. Maybe KJV is just being a little fancy with their words here. Anything look familiar? I don't.
The blast of thy nostrils.
The blast. What's the word there? Sound that out. Ruach. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Ruach. Wind, spirit, breath. This is the same word that's in Genesis. When God breathes upon the waters, right, and the Spirit of God, the breath of God, the wind of God, moved upon the face of the waters.
Which word is the same?
This is ruach. So in the KJV, it doesn't really use a word. I guess they're translating wind as blast. So you could say with a breath from thy nostrils. I think they wanted to. This is when the KJV gets a little wordy. What's that?
Oh yeah, that word.
Ruach. They try to. This can be a W sound. They're just don't worry too much about this, because this. Whenever you see this is called transliteration, and it's them trying to write out what this sounds like in a different alphabet. So don't worry too much about that. But this is R-U-H in a sense, right? So here we have blast, right, which is the word they're translating from ruach, right? So a breath from God. And what does that do? It gathered together the waters on each side, right? And they stood upright as a heap. So here again, you have a breath from God separating the waters. This is not accidental. This is a very intentional narrative device that is going on here. If we scroll down a little bit further to 10, see this part again? Same word, right? And you blew a breath, a wind, and the sea covered them. Right? So the same breath that had separated the waters is now the same breath that brings those waters back together. Right? And they sank as lead in the mighty waters. What's also interesting here, and this may not be as significant a connection, but this idea, this word here for covered, let's just take a look at where this word pops up. The word is kasah, to cover over. Genesis 7:19. I'll pull that up a little higher. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. What story is this from? Noah, right? And we looked at Noah and how creation, the ideas of creation and recreation were a huge part of that story, right? And so just as in the story of the flood, when you have the waters covering over the chaotic mess that was there before, right, with all of humanity, here you have the waters covering over Pharaoh's army. The last word I want to look at is down here in 16. This one's a little harder to catch. Fear and dread shall fall upon them. By the greatness of thine arm they shall be as still as a stone, till thy people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over which thou hast purchased. The word that's fun here, and I'm not expecting you to find this one, is the word purchased. And here's why that word is interesting. Let's come down and look at the word for to purchase. Kana. Is it ringing bells yet? No, not covenant. What if you take away that H?
It looks like candy.
No, that's an English word. It's a Latin word.
Which one again? I'm sorry.
Kana. If you took away this last AH.
Cana. Is it Cana?
Cain, maybe?
Cain.
Cain.
Oh.
Hold this word up. Remember, why is Cain called Cain? Does anybody remember? Why God has given me. Right? It actually says, by the help of the Lord, I have got this man. I have received this man. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Right? Look also a little bit later. This is with Melchizedek's blessing of Abraham. And Melchizedek blessed Abraham and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor or creator or maker of heaven and earth. What is going on here with this word kana? Which looks like this fun little guy. Or if you want to write it out, you write it out like that in English letters, Q-A-N-A-H. This word can mean to possess, can mean to buy. But we're also seeing it can mean, in a sense, create or make.
Our Bible says acquire.
What's that?
Our Bible says acquire.
Acquire? Okay, sure. I heard somebody asking, how can it mean all these things?
Mm-hmm.
Think about our word bear. It can mean a big fuzzy thing or you carrying something. Words just do this sometimes. They have this kind of breadth of meaning. English is a little different because it's lots of languages put together, but there's some elasticity to words, right? And to buy, to acquire, to possess, to create, these are all somewhat similar things. What's going on here is this idea in Exodus that is hearkening back here to Genesis, is this idea that God is creating his people through this event. God is making his people in the same way that he is the maker of heaven and earth. He is coming to own them, to possess them in the same way that he possesses heaven and earth. He is receiving them in the same way that Eve received Cain, right? In the same way that Eve received her firstborn son. Right? So it is through these waters that Israel is being created not just as something, in existence on its own, but is being created as God's possession. Right? Their identity is being created as a people. They are being, in a sense, molded from being Pharaoh's property to being God's property. Right? That identity shift is them being created. So here are all the ways that kind of the Exodus is hearkening back to Genesis and to creation. To say this isn't just Israel being free, but it's Israel being created, Israel being born as gods. Right? Because the next thing that happens after all this is God taking the Israelites to Mount Sinai to tell them how to be his people. Right? I've freed you, I've given you this identity, now let me show you how to live into that. Right? So we're going to hold off, let's take a look at this real quick. Look at the Passover Seder plate. I don't want to skip this too much.
Can I get one of those, please?
Yes. Does anybody else not have one? For those of you who have Passover as a part of your religious tradition, how does it typically get practiced? What's the focus of Passover for, say, Christians? If that's a tradition you come from. What gets focused on? Huh?
Anybody does Passover?
Anybody?
Repeat the question.
In Christianity, there is this idea of Passover, they don't quite celebrate Passover the way that Judaism does.
Yeah.
But there is this idea of Passover, or at least there's a part of the Passover story that Christians very much focus on.
Is it like when
The
they
ashes.
put the blood on the door?
Yeah, I was thinking about
Right. The blood on the doorpost, right? Because for Christians kind of, in the same way that the writers of Exodus are pointing back to Genesis to give meaning to this story, Christians will say Jesus is like the lamb from the Exodus story, right? But I want us to compare that to how Judaism remembers this story.
Okay, is that also communion?
Yeah, they tied in with that together, right? The blood of the lamb, connecting this to like the blood of Jesus, right? So there is some of that in there too. But look real quick at this Passover Seder plate. The Seder plate is a visual representation of the story, right? And notice that for Judaism, there is not, that central point is not the lamb, right? There almost is no central point because this story covers, or this visual representation, the Seder plate, covers the entirety of the story. You have the karpas, which is symbolizing that growth and fertility, right? This fruitful and multiply idea. You have that represented with the karpas, which is like a vegetable like parsley. You have the cheroset, which is supposed to represent the mortar, right? That was used to put the bricks together. right? So symbolizing forced labor and toil. You've got the maror, which is this really bitter herb, the bitterness of slavery. The chereset, which is a really inedible bitter herb, symbolizing the unpalatability of infanticide. Also, the repudiation of assimilation, right? The Israelites are not going to become Egyptians. Right? We're not going to assimilate to that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You said the mortar in number 2. What did that symbolize?
The mortar is what's used to bind bricks together, right? And so you see down at the bottom symbolizes the toil and labor of the Jewish people in Egypt, right? You have the zoah, right? And this is the only part that's really referencing the lamb, right? The only part that's really referencing that part of the story. And you see a little bit later, it's also serving a double meaning, because it's also symbolizing the arm of the Lord, right, that we read about in Exodus 15 that saved the Hebrew people, right? So it's kind of doing double duty there. And then you have the boiled egg, the baitza, or the beitza, right, which is also kind of pointing back to the lamb. I've heard people talk about the egg as, you know, a circle and representing like the circle of life. I've heard it represent, or it says it here, representing the Israelite people, that the more they go through, the tougher they get, right? So there's that. And then finally the salt water bowl, right? The sweat and the tears of the Jewish slaves. So notice that in the Passover feast, how the Hebrew people remember this freeing event encompasses the entirety of the story. Right? So the entirety of the Passover is the entirety of the story from their bondage to their freedom. Right? So it's something that's important to remember and look at when a lot of us might not be coming from this tradition. Between the Red Sea and the do all of you have a back to your page? I think there might be some that don't have a back.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay, got it. Okay, sorry about that. On the back of this page are the, oh, you have yours, okay. Are the 10 Commandments, and it's, oh, you have yours, okay. Did you have Okay.
Wow.
Okay. Great. After the splitting of the sea and before Sinai, there's a couple of like miraculous events. The people want to go back to Egypt because they're whining. Text is kind of showing that freedom is desirable, but it's not easy. Anyways, kind of moving through all that, let's focus on Sinai, because this is what God has freed the people to. As your article pointed out, what was the point of kind of reading all of Exodus together? What is the point of this narrative? Do I remember from that article? The point of the Exodus, the whole purpose of the Exodus, is worship, right? The text says a couple times when God is commanding Abraham to go and free the people, and when God is commanding Moses to go and free the people, and when Moses is talking to Pharaoh, the command is, let my people go so that they may worship me. Right? And their first response to being free is worship. So when we look at these 10 Commandments and these laws, think of it in this context. Think of it in the context of worship. Okay, what we have here are the 10 Commandments, and you can see here how they get split up differently by different traditions. Okay, another name for the 10 Commandments here that might help make sense of why they get split up differently is called the Decalogue. Right, this means 10 words. Deca means 10. Good. Right. This is referred to as the Decalogue. Now let's take a look at this on our Bible browser. All right, this is off of Oramus, right? So this is our NRSV. This is how the Decalogue starts out. Does this remind you of anything that we have talked about? The format of this. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Maybe of a type of covenant.
Suzerain covenant.
Good. This is the suzerainty treaty. Okay, now for a suzerainty treaty, what do we need? We need a preamble. We need a historical prologue. We need stipulations. We need blessings and curses. Right? If you do this, this is what will follow. If you don't do it, this will be the consequences. Good. Where are these parts here? Where's the preamble?
Yeah, I have the Lord your God.
Good. Yes. That's our preamble. Historical prologue?
I brought you
Good. Historical prologue. All right. Look at these stipulations. Now the stipulations and the blessings are kind of intermingled.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say are the stipulations?
You shall not.
before me.
Right. Pretty much everything that follows, right, is our stipulations. What are some blessings and curses?
The holy day.
Okay, where's the mother and the father one? Right here. Okay, good. So that your days may be long in the land. Right, here's a good blessing. What else?
Bless the Sabbath day.
Where is this? Sixth day is something. Okay, well this is more saying, therefore the Lord blessed it. It's saying this happened. Right? The blessings and the curses are going to be related to the people in the covenant. Right? So that your days may be long in the land. Right? What's another blessing or curse here?
Your God, am a jealous God, punishing.
Good. Punishing the children for the iniquity of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. And then the promise. Good. Exactly. Immediately following that. Right? Showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me. Good.
Curse, you shall not make wrongful use of your name.
Well, not to quit, right? I'm not going to forget. Right? Remember the seventh day. Let's see. I think that may be. Yes. Right? So here we see how like these blessings and stipulations are kind of merged together, right? So here we have a suzerainty treaty. Right? I'm the Lord your God, brought you out of this place. Here's the deal. Okay. Now also in suzerainty treaties, what we don't see here in 20, but we do see in chapter 24, is the sealing of the covenant. Right? So we see the reading in public, the giving of the tabernacles, the burnt offerings, like a ceremony that would go along with this. And that comes along in chapter 24. Now, I want you to look real quick at your 10 Commandments. And what I want you to try to do, or look at the Decalogue, I'm going to try to refer to it as that. I want you to think of how you would categorize these. If you had to put these commandments, these words, into some kind of categories, right? Put them, kind of separate them out. How would you do it?
One's against God and then one's against man.
How so?
Well, the first couple are the first ones are like how you deal with God, and then the ones after honor your father, your mother, you shall not murder, commit adultery, blah blah blah, are all the ones that deal with man.
Okay. Do y'all kind of agree with that? Any other ideas? Yeah, it's a really good observation. One way of thinking about this, kind of going off that, and keeping this in focus, keeping worship in focus, is that 1 through 4, according to everybody but the Catholics and the Lutherans, right? Everything from, let me see, from I'm the Lord your God to the Sabbath has to do with proper worship. If you are to worship, this is what it looks like. I'm the Lord your God. There are no other gods but me. You can't have idols. Don't misuse my name. Remember the Sabbath.
Are we taking this one right on?
Sure, yeah, these are yours. Right? 1 through 4 have to do with proper worship. 5 through 10 have to do with the worshiping community. What does the community have to look like if it is to be a people who worships?
They gotta be all in the same school.
What's that?
They gotta-
They don't all have to agree with each other. You just can't have a community that's murdering one day and then going to temple the next.
Right.
Right? So this is kind of the basic breakdown of the Decalogue. The two major points of the Ten Commandments, of the Decalogue, is proper worship and the worshiping community. Right? This is what the community has to look like if it is to worship well, and this is what proper worship looks like. And the fact is that for the Hebrew people, these two ideas go hand in hand. You cannot separate these out. Past the Decalogue, what we get are past the Decalogue, what we get are initially commandments dealing with the community. Right? This is what you need to do for slaves. This is what you do about property disputes. This is what you do about violence. This is how you pursue justice. And then it moves straight from that into talking about the tabernacle, right? Where worship takes place. The adornments of the tabernacle, right? Lampstands and altars, arks of the covenant, right? It goes through all of these little bits and pieces of worship because this idea of the community, the worshiping community, and proper worship go hand in hand. You can't separate them out. There's no such idea as private worship life and public social life, right? Here in the U.S., we very much created a space where you worship over here, and then you have public discourse over here, right? And in a sense, or so we say, this is how democracy thrives, right? Is that we try to keep religion out of that public space. Whereas for the Hebrew people, that distinction isn't even fathomable. Right. Yeah?
Is that still so today in Israel? In their government?
Maybe less so in Israel. More so in like surrounding countries of the Middle East, yeah. But there's even there are Muslim states that fall on that entire spectrum. There are Muslim states that very much separate the two. And there are Muslim states that very much bring them together. Right? So it's not homogenous. You can't look at any one religion and say, oh, they do it all this way. Right? Good. So so that idea of social life and religious life being one and the same. This idea of worship being central to the Exodus story gets especially highlighted in the story of the golden calf, right? And this happens this is just one of these little narrative sprinkles in the midst of these laws. So if you want to turn to that, it's in Exodus 32. I might pull it up here. Okay. Let me erase this. Because I want you to look for something weird here. And we're going to kind of come back to this much later down the road. But it is interesting. Okay. What is weird within these brackets? Anything strike you as odd?
Gods is plural.
And what's singular?
who brought you up out of the land of Egypt?
Or I can say, like, these are my students who do really well in class.
Right.
Oh, yeah,
And then
one
he says
calf, but
gods.
they
Yeah,
said,
that's what I meant.
Right? Yeah, this is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Right? They make one calf, and yet Aaron says, "Here, O Egypt, are your gods who brought you out of Egypt." Now, one thing that's important to note here is that Aaron is not here creating different gods. Okay? He's not saying, "Oh, the people are impatient. I'm just going to throw something together and say, hey, here's Shmoobity-Boo. He brought you out of Egypt." Right? Right? He's making images of the God who they are considering the one who brought them out of Egypt. This is, in a sense, Aaron making an idol of Yahweh. Okay, this is not him making an idol of a different God. This is an idol of Yahweh. Now notice too here, Moses has not brought down the commandments yet. In a sense, this isn't off limits. Right? Moses has not come down from the mountain with the commandment that says you shall not make an idol. Right? So this is kind of in bounds still, in the same way that Hagar having the child was in bounds. Right? So that's one important thing to remember, because I think when a lot of people read this passage, they think that Aaron's making some other deities and the people are just turning away from Yahweh. No, they just think that this is how you worship Yahweh. The other thing that's important here, and that kind of gives credit to the idea that Israel is kind of narrating their history, or their present history and circumstances through these old stories, is that Aaron only makes one calf, but he says, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When we get further down the road, we're going to have this king of Israel, once Israel and Judah split. This is Israel and this is Judah. Right? This is really confusing. Israel is one person, Israel is the whole land, and when they split, Israel is the top half. I know it's confusing. So Israel and Judah split into two kingdoms. When they do that, Jerusalem is down here. Right? This is where you are supposed to worship if you are a good Jew. Right? However, if you are now in this northern kingdom, you don't want to have to go down to these people you don't like. So what the king of Israel does is he sets up a shrine here and a shrine here. And in both of them, he puts golden calves. Okay? So here you have two golden calves, just to symbolize Yahweh, not to be some other god, but symbolizing Yahweh, but it's in two different locations. And this may be why we have here, "These are your gods, O Israel," is that they are putting in the mouth of Aaron, this priest gone awry, the same fall that is happening here. Right?
do you know why they would choose a calf, though?
Think of the same thing we were talking about with Moses coming down from the mountain with horns. Right? Calves and bulls are just the symbol of power and divinity.
Okay.
Typically in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
Yeah. So this would not be Israel making up something. It's like, I don't know, everybody else does chickens, let's do a calf.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah. Good. So, God also gets really angry about this. Moses has to talk down God from completely destroying the Hebrew people. You get this idea of God being a very angry, very jealous God, which he says, he gives Moses warning, I guess in the Decalogue, he says I'm a jealous God. But we see just how jealous. I think it's right here. Let's see. Yeah, he says, let's see. I've seen the stiffness. Now let me alone so that my wrath may burn hot against them and I may consume them. And he's just like, forget Abraham, I'll make of you a great nation. Right? Just going to start over again. And Moses has to talk God down from this.
Why is God so mad when he hasn't made that out of bounds yet?
It's a good question. And it's one of those things that might not make as much sense if we're reading this as a narrative and, saying, well, he hasn't yet said don't make any idols. But from a Jewish perspective where you are trying to shape these future generations by telling certain stories, it's going to make sense that God is upset that this is happening, right? It's just how the narrative kind of works out and where they're inserting this idea that God is a very jealous God. It could also be seen, and if we're taking it a little more narratively, that from God's perspective, the people of Israel are returning to their ways in Egypt, right? Instead of being truly free and being free of all those gods, they are now recreating the same systems that they were in before, right? They're almost, in a sense, recreating their bondage, right? This time just spiritually.